So in part 3 of the story of Judith in this series, Having Men for Dinner, we're going to talk about the story behind the story of Judith, or at least what some scholars think is the story behind the story. We're going to talk about Salome Alexandra. Salome Alexandra was the wife of a very late king of Judah, Alexander Janus. Her brother, and that's Salome's brother, was a leader of the Pharisees. So there was a lot of strife between her husband, who was the king of Judah, and her brother, who was one of the heads of the Pharisees. And the Pharisees suffered during her husband's reign. When her husband died during battle, he left the government in Salome's hands, not the hands of her sons. She concealed his death until the battle could be won and ended up ruling Judah as queen from 76 BCE until her death in 67 BCE. One of the things Salome Alexandra did was raise up the Pharisees until they eventually became the ruling class of Judah. She even went so far as to remove the Sadducees from Jerusalem. So in case you don't remember, the Sadducees were in charge of the temple, while the Pharisees were in charge of the law. The easy way to remember it, although it's a little bit gross, is that the Sadducees were sad later because the temple was destroyed. And the Pharisees were about the law, but they weren't always fair. While Salome Alexandra was queen of Judah, she strengthened Judah immensely and was able to turn back an invasion. What a queen. Oh, wait a minute. A powerful and beautiful widow, single-handedly turning back a foreign invader to save her people. Who does that sound like? It sounds like Judith. Many scholars believe that the story of Judith was written not long after the rule of Salome Alexandra, the last ruler of Judah to pass away while it was an independent country. That's why I used, as a picture of Judith, an icon of Salome Alexandra. So who loved Salome Alexandra enough to write a story that made her into a total hero that showed what the epitome of Jewish womanhood should do while men do nothing? Who loved Salome Alexandra that much? All of you have that information. It's just, can we get to the conclusion? Because it's a little tricky. Who loved Salome Alexandra enough to write the story of Judith in her honor? The Pharisees. But you might say, you just told us the Pharisees were obsessed with the law. And you might add, just look at the stories of Jesus. Jesus is always arguing points of the law with the Pharisees. And our preacher, priest, or pastor tells us that the Pharisees were really legalistic. So what are they doing writing stories? This is going to lead us into a really big thing we need to understand about the Bible. This is one of those things I want you to take away from this class, an understanding that you can carry forward with you as a tool you'll use for future Bible reading. Okay, but before we get to this really big thing, I want to review some of the big things you've already learned through this study, just so we're all on the same page. We learned that there are sacred stories in something called the Apocrypha, which is only included in some Bibles, but has always been respected by Christians throughout history. We learned that Jewish authors put markers in stories that told early readers that they are fictional and meant to be read as stories. We also learned that stories can have a big significance, like the story of Judith. We learned the connection between the words Judah, Judean, and Judaism. We learned that an easy and silly way to remember the Sadducees, bad, and the Pharisees, not fair. And that leads us to the big thing about why it makes sense that the Pharisees would have written the story of Judith in homage to Salome Alexandra. Pharisees were obsessed with the law, but what we call the law and what Jewish folks call the law is somewhat different. As I said earlier, when we think of the Pharisees talking about the law, interpreting the law, arguing with Jesus about the law, we think of actual laws, like thou shalt not steal, or this one from Exodus 21. If a bull gores a man or woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten, but the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring, and the owner has been warned but has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or a woman, the bull is to be stoned, and its owner also is to be put to death. That's Exodus 21, 28 to 29. It's on that handout that's linked in the show notes. They didn't put up with any repeat bulls in ancient Israel. That's the law to us. But when Jewish folks use the words the law, the word they use is Torah, which is not a set of laws, but the first 5 books of the Bible that include all those laws. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that's the Torah. That's the law. And what do those books have in them besides laws? Stories. And the Pharisees' job was to interpret and teach the law, not just the laws. And what do those books have in them besides laws? Stories. And the Pharisees' job was to interpret and teach the law, not just the laws. So now I'm going to ask you another question, and I want you to feel free to answer this in either Hebrew or Aramaic. You think I'm being facetious, but if you've ever been to church on Easter or even Christmas, you may have actually heard these words in Aramaic and Hebrew. What did people call Jesus when he was teaching? They called him something. A title means teacher. In Hebrew, rabbi. For the Aramaic answer, let me just say that I always get nervous on Easter when I've decided to use the Gospel of John for the resurrection story, because I know that the teenagers might giggle when I repeat what Mary Magdalene calls Jesus when she figures out that he is not the gardener. Do you remember what she calls him? She calls him Rabboni. But in the church I grew up in, the pastor always said Rabboni. Oh, it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? We always giggled, and I'm always terrified that I will pronounce it that way in church on Easter morning. Confession, I have done that. I just don't know how that should be pronounced, so I say it really loudly and confidently. By the way, that's a pro tip. That also works with any name of people or places you have to read out loud in Bible study or church. People are afraid to do that because they're afraid they'll mispronounce. Who cares? Pronounce it like you know you're right. And pretty soon your pastor or priest might start pronouncing Copernicus like Capernacus, because clearly you know something he or she doesn't. You said it with such confidence in Bible study. Back to our words, both in Hebrew and Aramaic. What do they call Jewish clergy today? Call them rabbis. Why? Because they're teachers. They are interpreters of the law. They are storytellers. Ask a rabbi a question, and most likely they will answer with Who does that sound like? You ask them a question and they answer with a story. That sounds like Jesus. Here's a reading from the Gospel of Luke. It's also in that document that's linked in the show notes. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You've answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. What's that? That's the story of the Good Samaritan from Luke 10. Jesus told parables. He was not the first person to do it. He didn't invent the genre. He was doing what rabbis do. He was telling stories. He was teaching. He was interpreting the law, which tells us 3 things. First, Jesus's religious training was probably done by Pharisees. That makes the most sense because Jesus told stories. Pharisees told stories, right? When Jesus argued the law with the Pharisees, he was arguing with his colleagues, with his brothers. Second, it tells us who won prominence in Jewish history. There was, tension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees at the time of Salome Alexandra that I mentioned, and maybe you've heard or read about this before, but there was this kind of tension between who was in charge of Judaism, the Pharisees or the Sadducees, or even maybe other groups. But to make a long story short, the Pharisees won, right? The Essenes disappeared. The Sadducees were so sad the temple was destroyed again, and there was no role really for them anymore. And the Pharisees, they were the ones that survived. So what we know of today as Judaism is technically Pharisaic Judaism, the Judaism of the Pharisees, a Judaism led by rabbis who teach, interpret the law, and tell and create new stories. Number 3, to bring us back around to Judith, this is why it makes absolute sense that the Pharisees would write a fabulous story about a Jewish heroine in honor of the queen who took them from social outcasts to the ruling class of Judah. They were storytellers, just like Jesus, answering questions with a story that all at the same time clarified and mystified. So let's do a really quick review of everything we've learned from the story of Judith that we've talked about here. We know what the Apocrypha is and where to find it. We know Jewish authors put markers in stories that told early readers that they're fictional and meant to be read as stories. And maybe we even got a little more okay with the idea of there being stories in the Bible. Stories are an important thing in Judaism. Rabbis tell stories. Jesus was called rabbi probably because he was a Pharisee or trained by a Pharisee, which is why he told parables. Pharisees dealt with the law, which means the Torah and not just the laws in it, and the Pharisees won. Today's Judaism is Pharisee or Pharisaic Judaism. And by the way, the word Judaism comes from Judah and Judean, and Judith was written probably in honor of Queen Salome Alexandra of Jerusalem, is the epitome of a Jewish woman who sets aside what she's supposed to be like as a woman for what needs to be done. And that's the story and analysis of Judith. Next time you pick this up, I hope you will. We're going to go through the story of Jael. Oh, hold on to your seats.